Hi, welcome to the 3D Pen Den. You probably heard from 3D pen promoters that now you will be able to draw in the air. And you will, sort of, almost. Except when you fight gravity, which is most of the time. Don't expect to pour some hot liquid plastic into the air and have it just stay there. Obviously, something needs to be holding it up until it's solid again. And with 3D pens, sometimes that something is you. But it doesn't have to be. There are better solutions. When you print on a 3D printer, you put some infill structure inside, and often also supports on the outside of the object. That will be removed after the print is finished. When you are using a 3D pen, you are flying solo. No digital files involved. You are the file. And the only thing supporting your project is your work surface. However, when you go 3D with the pen, you also need some support structure that will hold the thing in the desired shape until it's solid and afterwards can be easily removed and ideally reused and preferably infinitely customized to your changing needs. You need clay. Clay is actually more of a multitasker than you might expect. It will help you reproduce existing designs, design new ones, build complex shapes, fill in surfaces, support them when you smooth, support them when you need to strengthen them, and at the end you remove it and reuse it. The only issue left to decide is which clay is right for the job. Here is what we need from our clay. It needs to be non-stick, so it comes out clean, meaning it should not leave a ton of residue on everything. Non-reactive to heat and chemicals. More on that in a minute. And flexible, meaning it needs to stay soft enough for long enough to get it out when you are done. Play-Doh is the most non-stick of them all. It comes out almost perfectly clean, so I started there. And there are 3 videos on those tests. I will put the links in the description. Surprisingly, Play-Doh fulfills all the desirable clay requirements rather well. Plus, it is cheap and widely available. The only downside to it is that it doesn't sculpt all that well. It is always a bit lumpy and spongy and doesn't blend or smooth very happily, which will drive you nuts if you are used to sculpting with other clays. So inevitably, you will be tempted to try some other clays. And there are so many options. So let me share what I learned so far, so you can waste time on making different mistakes. Let's start with the classics. This is mud, specifically mid-fire stoneware. Sculpts way better than Play-Doh, as expected. However, it does leave a muddy residue on your hands, tools, surface, and more importantly, on the plastic model. So it is more messy than it's worth for gaining just a bit better sculpting ability. Doesn't come out all that happily either. because by now it's partially dry and hard already. I suppose you could dissolve it with water if you really wanted to, but that adds an unnecessary step. I would say this one is more trouble than it's worth. Stick with Play-Doh. Air-dry clays will harden by themselves over time. So they violate the flexibility issue, but what if we got them out before they harden? This is a Sculpey brand of air-dry clay. Feels very chalky. And it is way messier than even the ceramic clay. It's all over the place. There are other brands of air dry that could be tested, like paper clay, for example, but I think I'm giving up on these for the moment. Not clean enough. These are relative newcomers to the sculpting compounds family. Here we have 3 brands: Korean Honey Clay, Crayola Model Magic, and Sesame Street Model Fluff. It's a bit like sculpting with marshmallows. Feels pretty fun just to squish it. I will cut to the chase. These do actually work for this pretty well. And check all the boxes like non-stick and clean and not bothered by the heat. Except it doesn't stay pliable indefinitely. You do have to get done before they dry. However, if you need to work with them over time, you can keep the project in a plastic bag in between sessions to delay the drying. You actually have to do that even with the Play-Doh, otherwise it gets dry and crumbly on you. Comes out as clean as Play-Doh. The disadvantage of foam clays is that, like Play-Doh, they don't blend too well, and the whole shape stays a bit puffy. But overall, this is quite usable for this purpose. There is a whole family of clays that do stay flexible until they are baked in your home oven. I used to work with polymer clays quite a bit, so I have all these brands on hand to show you, and also a few cautionary stories to share. There are plasticizers in polymer clays that keep them flexible, which evaporate during baking. However, in the meantime, they eat into a lot of the plastics they come in contact with. And it happens over time, so you wouldn't know right away. Here is an unbaked polymer clay head that got left sitting on a styrofoam egg carton. Got fused to it pretty well over time. I had these clays eat through plastic placemats and various other surfaces. And while the polymer had survived, sort of, it just got pretty slimy, the egg carton melted completely. And because there's always some tiny residue of the clay left on your project, I would not risk it melting over time from some chemical reaction with the plasticizer. Unless you fully understand the composition of the clay and of the plastic filament you are planning to use, I would call polymer clays chemically reactive and stick with Play-Doh. I did try to bake it first to get the plasticizers out, but then it gets really hard to get it out of the 3D pen print, because the filament shrinks pretty tightly over a hard sculpture. As I said, not ideal. Now for the clays that make the most sense for us, because they are designed to stay flexible and not harden at all, ever. There are 2 types of these. The ones made for the adult artists and the ones made for the upcoming artists. This is Plastilina, the Pro Art brand, and I had this for years, so I can't show you the original package anymore. This sculpts beautifully, but makes a huge mess once you subject it to any heat. because the art modeling clays contain waxes of different types. So essentially it's like melting a candle. It actually goes completely liquid and makes a puddle after a while. Disappointing, because it looked so promising. For a while, I was under the impression that the kids' versions of these do not melt. But actually, some do and some don't. This is a Walmart brand for artists 4 and up. I was obviously way overconfident that this would work, so I got 2 packages. Well, the takeaway from this is that you have to test each brand of these separately with a heat gun. If it turns glossy in the first 30 seconds, it is not a good sign. You will get a puddle in under a minute. This one is made by Hasbro, the Play-Doh people, and it says it contains wheat, which tells me it is probably mostly flour, like regular Play-Doh. Good for ages 3+, so it can't be too toxic. So let's do a heat test on this one. Lasted for 2 minutes of heat exposure, and it did crack, but it's still completely firm. Time to test it in action. It sculpts better, doesn't harden ever, doesn't react to heat, and generally works for our purposes. So I have been using this one lately. It is not quite as non-stick as Play-Doh, but non-stick enough not to make a mess on your hands and tools. Sticks to the surface a bit, but it can be picked up with a ball of the same clay and comes out fairly cleanly, maybe with slightly more residue than Play-Doh, but essentially it works. So what works as a 3D pen support clay? Play-Doh, the foam clays, and kids modeling non-hardening clay made by Hasbro called Sculpt and Mold clay, which is my current favorite because it stays soft and reusable forever. Each group has its pros and cons, but that will depend on your sculpting preference. As always, the clay forming technique will not solve all your problems, just some of them. If you are making 16-inch ball, you will probably want to support it with something other than that much clay. Just saying, there are different strategies for different situations. So watch this one next and then go and make something.